Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of our Let's Talk Climate Change series at Azim Premji University. It's a special delight to welcome an old friend and colleague and someone whose work I admire very much, Professor Ruth DeFries from Columbia University. And Ruth is difficult to summarize her work in a very short period, but I can tell you that for about 40 plus years, her work on sustainability has been very well known. She works on land change, biodiversity, climate change, sustainability, and a lot of interrelationships between all of these and human well-being in a way that people often don't do in the climate space, because people working on climate work on climate, as we discussed, and biodiversity work on biodiversity. So the kind of perspective she has, I think, is incredible. She's also written 2 extraordinary nonfiction books. Let's look at the past few years and has humanity's progressed significantly or slid back both on the sustainability and human well-being fronts. And we'll dig into some of these issues today. She is also going to come and talk to us about her work on millets and climate change, which we will see in another YouTube video. So do check that out also on our channel. But first today, let's talk to Ruth about other issues. So welcome to the university, Ruth. It's a great pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Harini. It's so good to see you again. As you said, we've been friends and colleagues for quite a number of years.
Yes. So let me start with the basic question, I think, which to me a lot of your work focuses on, is you're a hopeful scientist. I think if I can characterize you like that.
I think so.
Yeah. And it's not very easy to be a hopeful scientist working on issues of climate change and sustainability, because often the world is changing, as we know, very rapidly around us. So what do you feel gives you hope, and how do you think ecosystems can regenerate? Do you think there's hope for the world? Where do you see hope?
Well, it is hard to see hope in the current situation, but we have to keep hope, because what else do we have? If we don't keep hope, then we give up, and then the future is guaranteed not to be better and not to go in a positive direction. But if we think about the broad sweep of human history, this is the first book you mentioned, the first nonfiction book, The Big Ratchet, the broad sweep, we see many examples about how many times it seemed like humanity was on the brink. And this is, I told this story in relation to food production, but you could tell the same story in relation to health or energy or any other big issue that's important for humanity. And how many times it seemed like we were up against, this is it. And then, not to be a techno-fix kind of mentality, because I don't believe in that at all, but then some human ingenuity kicks in, because when you're up against the wall, that's when there's no choice. So we are somewhat at that point now, and there's no guarantee. I would not say that we should assume that a technological magic will appear and solve all the problems that we have in the world. I wouldn't want anyone to think that. But we are seeing signs towards renewable energy, thinking more about the underutilized crops that are coming back more into the thinking. So I want to keep hope. The question is how quickly, how long does it take for this kinds of ingenuity to get over these humps? How long does that take, and how much hardship is there in the process?
Yeah, that's the thing, right? I mean, if you think of the climate change effects that we're seeing this year, especially, you were talking about the smoke in Toronto that made its way to where you live in New York. And if you think of that, and then the heat waves that are across North India, where you've been doing your field work, and then the rainfall that's been across North and South India, which is also where you've been doing your field work now, and so many parts of the world, I think one can get despondent. But to me, what this tells us is we might hit 1.5 degrees, but we don't want to hit 2. And if we hit 2, we still need to do something, because we don't want to hit 2.5, and we need to keep doing something or the other, as much as we can, to arrest this, right?
Yeah, absolutely, as much as we can to arrest it. But even if we could stop all greenhouse gas emissions today, we're still facing climate change for quite some number of decades. So this summer has been very made it very obvious that climate change is not an issue for the future. It's here with us now. And that we need to recognize that, yes, we need to stop emitting greenhouse gases, but we also need to learn how to live with climate change. So, for example, greening cities, what you work on, Harini, and where we go, what crops to use less water, and think about those sorts of decisions that are within control. Flooding, all the tragic flooding that's been happening in northern India, how to have land use and vegetation along stream beds to reduce flooding. So how much is within some control to be able to reduce the impacts of climate change?
One of the things I think we both realize we worry about is a lot of it requires global coordination to fix, but a lot of it seems to be that for local leaders or policymakers or planners or anyone working at the local level, this is now becoming an easy bugbear. You push it up. You say it's because climate change is happening and I'm not responsible because the whole world is responsible. So how much of this kind of adaptation, and if I hear you correctly, what you're saying is we need to adapt to climate change, because if we turned off the tap today and we stopped burning fossil fuels, we're still going to face the effects for several decades. And so while we fix mitigation, we have to do much more adaptation than we do. But if we do that, how do we do it in a way that is not just all about climate change, but also about biodiversity, health, well-being, resilience in a more broad sense?
Yeah, that's what makes this topic of sustainability so challenging is because to get to sustainable solutions and sustainable management, it is a question of considering so many different dimensions: climate, biodiversity, human well-being, above everything, I would say, human well-being, hydrology. So many different aspects need to come together. And the way that our world is constructed is against considering all these issues together. We have a Ministry of Agriculture, we have a Ministry of Environment, we have other ministries, and they each have their mandate, and that mandate does not include coordinating with the other ministries. So that is something that needs to...
That is something also that comes back to the idea of the wicked problem that we talked about and we wrote about. So I just want to, a lot of the viewers of this will not know what a wicked problem is. So could you tell them with maybe some examples from your work in India?
Yeah, so a wicked problem is a term that came out of urban planning in the 70s, and it came out of the recognition that urban planning alone does not solve urban problems of crime and social problems in cities. So the idea of a wicked problem is that there's no one solution. It's very complex. Everyone will come to that problem with their own perspective, and that there's not a linear path between recognizing the problem and solving the problem, like putting your foot on the pedal of a car that makes it go faster. That's a simple, you'd say, a tame solution. But a wicked problem is so enmeshed and intertwined that any solution you can think of, well, everyone will think of a different solution, and every solution leads to another problem.
Right. And that reminds me of where we run an online course on sustainability, and one of the first audience we tried to talk about this course to was a bunch of engineering graduates who are very interested in tech solutions only, and of course technology has a role to play, like you said. But we had one guy ask us a question, and for us, he's the app guy that we're always trying to address. He's become like a meme for us. And he actually stood up and he said, I want to do something on sustainability, so I want to design an app that makes people take public transport. And so we said, no, ours is a framing sustainability course, and it will help you understand how to think about sustainability more broadly. But we can't teach a course on how to make an app to get people, because first of all, we don't think just an app by itself will make people take public transport. Of course, there are information asymmetry issues and other things that people need apps for. But then we realized to get this idea across to people, that it's a wicked problem, that there are many interconnections, you need to understand how everything feeds into each other, is often a little frustrating for someone, and then they give up. And
Yes.
so what do you do?
Well, it is human nature wants to find a linear, simple, quick solution. That's the way humans are constructed. So it's quite natural to turn to, we have a problem with climate, let's turn the tap on energy, or a simple technological solution. But because these problems are so wicked and intertwined, that simple solutions often lead to new problems. Like, for example, take solar energy. To implement solar energy, now there's so many minerals that are required, which lead to other sets of problems. Not to say that solar energy is bad, but there's no quick fix, one way to attack a problem. So we're so drawn to quick fixes that how do you get across that the world is is very, very complex? And I think it's through the way that you have done your teaching and your writing, which is so compelling, is through case studies and stories.
So what you've been teaching students, well, at Columbia, but other places before that for a long time. What do you feel are some of the things that students really resonate with in terms of how do you get them to think about these things differently? Think of interconnections, think of the systems, think of action.
Well, I think first of all, I know there's a lot of anxiety that students have. So the first thing is to try to, it's good that they're so aware that they do have that anxiety, but just having anxiety is not going to solve problems. So when I try to convey this complexity, try to take it to something in their everyday lives. Even something as simple as keeping the fridge clean in a shared space. The commons.
Yeah.
Your topic, the commons. And how to think about managing the commons, the fridge that gets to be a mess if you don't manage it. And, have them work on a problem that they can very much relate to, that has these elements of complexity. And it's so funny that when I used that example of the dorm room fridge, what they came back with really changed my thinking. They said, well, we don't really care if the fridge is a mess. Okay. Different perspective. I don't think about that.
Okay.
But that's like a wicked problem. Everyone has their own perspective on it.
But it'd be very interesting because one of the first speakers in the Let's Talk Climate Change series was Jay Asundi from C-STEP, and they work on this large-scale modeling of what are the paths India would follow for getting out of the energy crisis. And so because you need energy, and then you can't keep burning carbon, right? So one of the things they found in their modeling, and which is so obvious after the fact, is that India is really ramping up electric vehicles, and that's part of its plan. And India is also ramping up renewable energy, which is part of its plan. But renewable energy isn't at the stage yet where it supplies a majority of the grid. It'll get there, but it's not at the stage. Whereas it's much easier to get EVs, electric vehicles, off the ground. And so when you get electric vehicles off the ground, where are they going to get the charging stations from coal-burned electricity, which means it's going to fuel so much more coal burning in the next few years. And on the other hand, if you don't do this, you're not going to have that infrastructure, the ecosystem up for electric vehicles to transition away from pollution. So it's good for pollution in cities, but maybe bad for pollution in the places where coal gets picked up, and it's a really wicked problem.
Yes.
And
these are all wicked problems.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they would have already been solved. Yes, but people who work on electrification, I'm getting outside of my area of expertise here, say that the purpose of electrification is to have the system set up that's electrified so that when there is a clean grid, then
it can replace.
You can switch.
Right. Yeah. Which makes sense. And I think, I don't know, how are things in the US right now with hopefully the transition to...
US and hope doesn't quite go together these days, politically.
Yeah. But in terms of the Green New Deal? or the Inflation Reduction
Act.
Yeah.
Well, there's there's quite a bit of funding, and how to spend that in the most productive way, I think, is the question. So sometimes when a lot of money becomes available in the system, like we saw this with COVID relief, it's hard to spend it well.
If we come back to, so there's so many of these global treaties, and so there's the Sustainable Development Goals, there's the Convention on Biological Diversity, and most countries are signatories to that. Then there's the Kyoto, all the the COP meetings and the climate commitments that we have, and then the land degradation commitments to that, and so many other things that various countries commit to. What do you think you see in terms of the largest land transformations taking place in, let's say, the global south as a result of all of this?
Yeah. Well, first, these global scale kinds of commitments, I don't believe that we should put all our hopes on those commitments. They're good sort of frame setting and issue raising, but countries have their own needs and perspectives, and it's very, so many commitments have not actually been met that I think we have to be realistic about global scale commitments, especially with the current state of geopolitics.
Yes.
Not to say that there should not be global discussions, but I think we need to think much more at national, local levels.
Which is, I guess, your point about the fact that there's some things that you can do at an international level, and you may not be able to do much, but maybe you can do something in your neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
And what are the things that you think people could do in their neighborhoods to actually make those changes?
I think is to support the leaders that will make good decisions, because because local actions in and of themselves will not solve big problems. So that's the most important thing, is to have the leaders in place who can, like you said, have this kind of systems perspective to sort of know what you said about the electric vehicles and that means relying on coal, to have that kind of systems understanding and the ability to think about how these different issues trade off. So that's probably the most important thing that people could do. But there's still so, our everyday lives, our what we value, how we raise our children to value things in life that are not about consuming resources. That's probably the most important thing we do, is what values we pass on to our children.
Exactly. And if you think of that, are there any success stories? I hate to call them success stories, but any positive examples? I'm sure there are many from all the work that you've done, but what sticks in your mind of places where people have thought systems, even though they don't understand them as systems maybe formally, but they thought systemically and implemented things that are positive changes?
Well, I live part-time in upstate New York, in the New York City watershed, the Catskills watershed, which is an iconic example of ecosystem services. And being there and living there, you really do get to know how that system functions. And there was so much forethought about what water the city is going to need in the future. This goes back more than
people will not
years.
know the geography, so you can tell them.
Okay, so the setup in New York City. New York City has the best urban water, I think, in the world, and it is not filtered. It's not filtered. It comes from upstate New York, maybe 200 kilometers away, and it comes to New York City through aqueducts, through gravity, and it, as I said, is not filtered. So the way that it stays clean is because the watershed is protected. The watershed for the reservoirs is protected. And that system works because, first of all, there's quite a lot of funds that go from New York City to support it. So it's not that replicable in many places around the world. But there's the institutions that work with farmers, work with landowners, work very locally, to manage land in a way that is that keeps the watershed protected, keeps sediment out of the streams, provides credit to landowners for managing their land in the way that protects the watershed. And it all works together. I'm not saying it's perfect, because it does have a history that when those reservoirs were built in the early 20th century, there was towns that got displaced, and there were quite a few people who died building the system, immigrant workers. So I'm not saying it's a completely rosy story, but the more I see that story, the more I see that institutions can work together to achieve this goal of protecting the watershed.
Right. And because I was in Rome, as you know, for 6 weeks this summer, and I was just looking at the water there also. It was so nice, really, to walk the streets and see that you just have a fountain and it's got water. I mean, of course, the Indian side of me, always raised to say, turn off the tap, turn off the tap. We kept looking at this tap and saying, there's water just dripping and draining away. But it's there and it's fresh water, and anyone can stop and refill their bottle. And then I find it very interesting that the moment you go into a restaurant, most people are buying bottled water to drink, because I'm thinking you have all this water around, and that's the reason it should be there, so that you don't use all this plastic. Yeah. But I think it was so well planned. So I think consumption has changed, and people tend to prefer bottled water just because it's the idea of purity, and without realizing the microplastics that are in there. But it was really well planned in 3rd century BC or 5th century BC or some point. And that's the forethought that carried us today, right? Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, do you think, what would urban planning, I mean, the pace at which Indian cities are expanding, and you've seen it in Kanha. So again, for many of the viewers watching this, they will not know, but you also have a home close to Kanha National Park, right? And you've been seeing the city, or buildings at least, creep closer and closer. That's going to increase. And by 2015, you know how many people India is going to have in cities, and it's going to be more than 50% urban, probably. How should we build our cities in India to make them more sustainable?
Well, I'll turn around and ask you that question because you're the urban expert. But I would say also a flip side of that is thinking about the rural areas. And, India is famous for having a few number of very large cities. And how to think about the rural economies so that not so many people need to go to the cities to have more vibrant rural economies. We've worked together on the question of seasonal migration. How to keep small industries and economic opportunities and livelihoods in rural areas so people have options. Not that people should not go to urban areas if that's what they aspire to. The whole point of development is that everyone can reach their aspirations. So some people might want to live in cities, and some people might want to live in rural areas. But as now, it's very difficult. We all know for farmers to make a go of it in rural areas. So there's so much reason to go to urban areas. But how to make rural economies more, diversify livelihoods so that there are more options.
And I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit, because, again, for people listening, the kind of work you've been doing in central India on migrants, what did that find? Why do people migrate? And what kind of households migrate? And how do they deal with resilience to climate shocks?
Yeah, well, but what we found there was that it is the poorest households that are sending people to the cities, and so that signals that it's desperation, not aspiration. Although there is some, young men who want to see the world, fine if that's what they aspire to. But I'd say that's the minority. That most is migration out of necessity, and seasonal migration. Where it comes between Diwali and Holi generally, and then go back. So what that kind of migration does is then that labor is not there for a long period of time. The family structure, because the it's typically a male who will go to do the migration, so it changes the family dynamic. So there's so many sort of implications of that lack of livelihood opportunities.
And so cities seem to be offering that, at least a possibility of some resilience.
Yes.
Not the best kind of resilience, but some resilience.
Yeah.
So I'll just maybe wind up with one question. Looking at all of these changes that you're seeing in the sustainability landscape, because everything's changing, now AI is coming in, or the pandemic, or what kind of sustainability courses as universities, what should we be teaching? What are the kinds of things people want to learn?
I think the best way to teach is just not to teach. It's to let students be out in the world and sort of develop their own observations, and then and recognize. I think when I don't know if this happens to you, but when in class start talking about complexity and wicked problems and how hard these problems are, students are relieved. They're like, oh, I didn't, that lets me understand why I'm having such a hard time grappling with these problems. Different from their peers that are doing engineering, say, and coming up with solutions that you can't just sit down overnight and write a few equations and come up with solutions for sustainability problems. So I think they see it as a relief just to acknowledge how complex these problems are, and then to be in the real world. Like, for example, I take a class to learn about this New York City watershed and spend some time there and talk with the people who manage the system. I think those are the best kinds of learning experiences for students and for everyone.
Fantastic. Yeah. We also, so I think this is something that we need to be thinking about. How can we get all kinds of students into all kinds of situations that they haven't seen? Because I think all of them see sustainability problems around their real daily life, but they may not recognize them as such because, like you said, you're thinking about a job or going out in the evening or something else. But sometimes when you're in a different setting, that's when you see all of this. Yeah. Well, just I guess the last thing I have is how do you get them to see interconnections? Increasingly, one of the things we are realizing is that you can't do sustainability science and sustainable development and then the humanities. We need to start integrating these. So what do you think with your students? Because you have students from across the world. Are they more interested in science to humanities issues, science and social science issues, or do they want to tend to be more siloed, or is it all over the place?
Well, it's all over the place, but generally the students want to help save the world, and we love them for that.
Yeah, we do.
It's not so easy, so we'll have to temper down their expectations about how much they can actually save the world, but to focus on whatever topics they focus on. And I think students, at least the students that I see come through, are much more interdisciplinary minded than, say, my generation was when we came through, just inherently.
I think so too, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe because they're more engaged with the world, or they're thinking about the problems, so they recognize all the different aspects to energy and food and all the problems that they think about. But I don't think we have to convince them that that interdisciplinary view is what's needed to understand these problems. I think they already know that, at least the students that I see.
I think so too. I think the challenge is more for us as educators to put together the kinds of programs that allow them space to do that, probably. And anyway, we talked about a number of different things, but this is very nice, Ruth. I think we can keep going on for another hour, but I think we've touched a lot of things. And I guess we learn why one of the things we've been talking about, and which is why it's been very nice to talk to you specifically, is it's nice to have optimistic conversations about sustainability, I think.
Well, I would say cautiously optimistic. And I'd say we have to work toward the world that we want to see. We can't assume that it will be there or someone else will make it happen.
Yes. But it's not a doom and gloom.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.